can stay on time. So, my name is Cassandra Page. I work at Regent University with our keynote speaker that I'm about to introduce. So, Dr. Jen Ripley is a professor of psychology in the Hughes Endowed Chair of Integration at Regent. She serves in our Doctor of Psychology program and also as the co director of the Caris Institute. A fellow of APA Division 36 and former delegate to NCSPP, Dr. Ripley focuses her research on positive psychology, including forgiveness and relationships. Her current projects include a clinical field study of hope-focused couple therapy and a grant-funded project for the Spiritual and Religious Competencies Project through the University of South Alabama. Author of several books and over 50 reference articles, Dr. Ripley is dedicated to promoting flourishing in interpersonal relationships. And I can attest to that as well. She's been at Regent for, we just calculated, and she's in her 24th year, so I've had the pleasure of serving with her over the past 9. So, Jen, come on up.
Thank you, Cassandra. It's such a pleasure to work with you as well and to be back at NCSPP. So, yeah. So for those of you who were in Nassau, Bahamas, or Las Vegas, or New Orleans, I was there in the trenches doing the program director thing. It was my rotation in doing that, and then they fortunately got rid of me and replaced me with better people. So, but I am glad to be here in the trenches with all of you and the people who are producing the next generation of psychologists. And sometimes in all the detail work, I know you forget that you're doing that, I think. I know I did. And it's really important for our country and for the globe to produce excellent psychologists. So welcome. I'm going to talk about forgiveness today. What we're going to cover is a little bit about what is the use in forgiving. Is it useful? We're going to think about ourselves a little bit, if we've ever been offended, ever wish we could forgive but just couldn't seem to find it in us, and apply that particularly in our roles as professors, trainers, and supervisors. We're going to think a little bit about apology and forgiveness, if that's important, and then also corporate apology and forgiveness, and particularly reflecting on the APA apology letter, right? And what is the collective responsibility there? So join me if you will. Let's first talk about my second favorite movie ever, okay? This is my second favorite movie. You can ask me later my first favorite. It's very, very annoying. But apologies and forgiveness, they go hand in hand. And it's meant to try to create a better world because there's a deep need for a better world. Now, this storyline has a little bit of a twist on the typical space cowboy genre. The Fifth Element plot involves Corbin, who's this regular taxi driver in the year 2314, on a quest to unite the 4 elements of fire, earth, water, and air with the 5th element named Lilu, right, who's this human-like woman possessed of an inherent goodness that can be used to fight an invading evil. But the ultimate message is how to respond to pain and suffering. Now, this movie did come out in 1997, so that kind of dates me. And if you also saw it in the theater as an adult, then you're with me on that. But meaningful storylines that make a point don't come around every year. So who has seen this movie? So almost the room. Okay, good. Good. Well, let's just return to that movie. Maybe this will make you want to watch it again. I don't know. So it was the comedian George Carlin who gave the blessing, "May the forces of evil become confused on the way to your house." But that was not what was happening in the Fifth Element. This is the great evil, a truly vicious and terrible force in the form of a planet. It's kind of an antimatter type of destroying the universe bent. It's willfully targeting the earth, trying to destroy it, and it bends everything to its will. Even if you talk on the phone to it, the great evil causes people to cringe, bleed, and die. And they still talked on the phone in the year 2314, which is just very interesting. All right. So the forces of evil are not becoming confused on the way to the house. There's this vicious evil presence. Into this problem of evil enters 2 heroes, 2 women who play the roles of rescuers. Lilu is the all-good but confused and needy savior character who has the power to save the earth and destroy the evil planet. Bruce Willis plays the part of Corbin Dallas, her trusty sidekick. And the diva, The diva is this fantastic blue alien opera singer who has probably the best costume in all of history, I think, in the movies, right? And she is holding the magical 4 elements in her body for Lilu to find and obtain. Corbin plays the role of space cowboy. He's driving a taxi. He is owing money to everyone. He's about to be, thrown in with the police. And literally, Lilu falls into his life. At first, it looks like the regular space cowboy movie. Cowboy protects, helps the girl from the evil alien figures that are all chasing them. But this franchise is subverted in the story as Corbin Dallas responds to the sacrificial death of the diva. She uses her final words for Corbin and for Lilu and for all of the earth. She is more fragile than she seems. She needs your help and your love, or she will die. So Corbin is drawn by the diva's beauty and the music, and he sheds tears at the death of the diva, and his character begins to transform because the space cowboy is not supposed to shed tears. He begins to care about Lilu by now and doesn't know what to make of her. He's becoming more than a cowboy, racing to fight evil with guns and bombs. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of guns, there's a lot of bombs, there's definitely many chase scenes, it is Hollywood, but Corbin's a different kind of cowboy. All right. After much chasing and shooting, Lilu has a big problem. It's a great and existential problem. She asks, what's the use in saving life when you see what you do with it? This problem is found in war, in racism, in violence, in systemic inequalities. My own research is in family-level offenses. It's found in political offense and in individual harm. It's a problem of war, racism, and inequality. Epicurus said, if the gods listened to the prayers of human, all humanity would quickly have perished, for they are forever praying for evil against one another. But after much chasing, finally the reluctant Corbin, Lilu, and their troop of friends get to the 4 elements of the celestial temple. And in this edge of the scene, they begin to figure out how to make the stones do their job to save the earth from the great evil, while this dispassionate military announcer is counting down the seconds until the earth will be destroyed. Right? And in that moment, Lilu asks this big question, what is the use of saving life when you see what you do with it? And the announcer says 40 seconds to impact. Corbin says, you're right, but there are some things, very nice things worth saving. And Lilu says, like love? I don't know love. I was built to protect, not to love. And Corbin says, I need you very much. In this desperate plea to save his life and everyone else's, will he answer in a way that is using Lilu, right, to save, or will he listen to the diva? Why, she asks him to this question of, I need you very much. She says, why? Long pause, and the countdown to the Earth's destruction goes 10. 9, 8, 7. Well, you'll have to see the movie to see how it ends. But this is the basic problem in all of history, and it appears in great novels, artwork, history, and psychology theory. What do we do about the harm that has been done? You might stop right now and consider any harm that you have received or done to others yourself. Even in the role as a professor, I know I have sometimes accused a student of doing something like plagiarizing or cheating on my test, only to find out, actually, that's not what happened. Right? And I offended them pretty deeply for that. Or maybe you've looked out for yourself over other people at work and that individual harm. And that doesn't even begin to examine the ways in which being a wealthy American creates systems that can harm people, the environment, the animals in our food chain, clothing creation, even driving or flying to a conference, because I'm just here to lift y'all up and make you feel better. The collective sharing of guilt is particularly difficult for us as humans. It requires us to dissolve our bloated egos and to focus on interdependence for psychological and community level healing. There's a Navajo surgeon from Crown Point, New Mexico. It's about 3 hours west of here, named Dr. Lori Alvord. She tells the story of a young boy that had a dream that there would be famine if their community kept hunting. The leader didn't listen, and there was a local famine. And after that, they made a commitment to subsistence hunting. The healing they needed was at a community level. Even if individuals themselves didn't kill animals, they all benefited from the meat and the resources from their hunting. Healing would necessitate not isolating that boy, right, and his dream, or the people from their environment, but laying down their egos and connecting to the community and the environment. This is a really, really difficult thing for us to do as humans. Right. Have you ever wanted to forgive something, but you couldn't find it in you? Just kind of like reflect for yourself. Pause for us and say, forgiveness isn't the only, and it shouldn't be the only way to compensate for offenses and for wrong, right? Offenses create a justice gap, an imbalance in the justice of the universe, in the workplace, in the city, in the family, and justice is the response when you can find it. Offenses create this gap. Forbearance is common, right? Not only in the human world, but also in the animal world. And particularly of the cats in my home, 2 cats, 1 dog. There's a lot of forbearance in my home that happens. And especially emphasized in non-Western cultures. I was just in Thailand, and I was talking with our Buddhist tour guide on a very long drive. And his preference was to let karma take care of offenses whenever possible. So giving it over to the universe or to a deity to help find ultimate justice. That's an option that many people take, right? Sometimes we get lucky and we just forget, right? Sometimes offenses are smaller ones, and over time, we just forget about them. That's another way to handle injustice. Revenge is particularly common in Hollywood. If you look for the term revenge, you will find it in many, many movie and series titles. And so many groups of people will also seek revenge. And shaming is also something that people do to balance the scales. So, poor little dog, he didn't know any better. All right. But forgiveness is one option. Offenses that occur in the real world are not conceptual. They exist here and now and all around us. They're both historical and present. The clients we see or those served by our students are often dealing with pain caused by offense in their life. Pain is actually the work of us as psychologists. That's what we do. We deal in trauma, harm, and sometimes we deal in hate. As clinicians, we can be duped into thinking that pain can never be forgiven, that it's too great, it's too extensive, it extends through many situations. But our clients and our students need us to address that harm that's been done by us or against us. That the offenses themselves can be understood and they can be responded to with intentionality. But we cannot go into this with pie in the sky, blind optimism, and a happy-go-forgiving kind of attitude. That aspect of positive psychology is not helpful here. We don't need some kind of perfect science or technology either. The first 100 years of psychology, we thought we could maybe create some kind of psychological utopia, but we are very aware that that is not going to happen. What we need is a strong response. Justice is a strong response, and so is forgiveness. But before we address forgiveness, I want to take a moment to lament for injustice. We wouldn't need forgiveness and other ways to address injustice gaps if harm wasn't large and pervasive in human life. Injustice gaps, they vary. They can be small and they can be very little, like a little bridge that you can kind of jump over. My research is in couples, and I call them sometimes the 10-cent offenses, right? My husband knew I was having a bad day and forgot to ask me about it at the end of the day, right? Things like that. I'll forget that and move on. But injustice gaps can also be large $10,000, $1 million ones. Infidelities, gambling the family savings away, or violence. Justice is important, and it's important across situations. Our justice system is set up to address injustice, but it's deeply imperfect. Ironically, it inflicts more injustice on the people who are seeking justice than it provides. And we humans are really, really good at harming each other. Without revealing too much, I wondered if you'd be willing to raise your hand if you, either yourself or someone in your direct circle, like your household or your direct circle of people in your life, have been on the receiving end of a crime, an assault, a robbery, a theft, or something like that. Yeah, look at that, most of the room. All right. So many of us. Now keep your hand up if you found satisfactory justice through the justice system. It's like a few. Yeah, so many. May 31st, 2019, a man named Dwayne Craddock sent a resignation letter to his boss and brought weapons into the municipal building complex where my husband works. Minutes later, 12 people were dead and several more were severely injured. People survived by barricading into their offices, which is where what my husband was doing that afternoon, as he alternated between pulling people out of the parking lot to a building, at least they were hoping it was a safe space, and piling up chairs on the door. He called me, unaware what was going on. They hadn't announced it yet. We knew it was a hostage situation. We didn't know if anyone had been harmed yet. So a couple hours later, we heard the real news. And the ripple effects of that day continue at his work with low morale, trauma symptoms, reactivity. It's common throughout the municipal complex and all their workers. The shooter died that day at the hands of the police. Was justice satisfied? Most everyone would say no. And the ripple effects are wide. This is a letter that was posted by the family of Dwayne Craddock that they sent to CNN. It says, the family of Dwayne Craddock wishes to send our heartfelt condolences to the victims. We are grieving the loss of our loved one. At this time, we wish to focus on the victims and the lives lost during yesterday's tragic event. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families of those who lost their lives and those recovering in the hospital. The family is affected. That shooting happened, and there continues to be conspiracy theories throughout our community, even in this month, of people that were affected. And that's one shooting on one day in 2019, in a nation full of it. In fact, CNN just reported this week that we are on track to have 2 mass shootings a day so far in 2023. I expect, though, I do not need to convince anyone in this room that injustice is a major human problem. No one argues that the world is just or equal. No one avoids harm. Live long enough and it will come to your door. Whether a major crime like a workplace shooting or an injustice felt by my youngest nieces and nephews who complained that the toys were taken. Right? Their parents are unfair. Or the mean girls in middle school, which is actually a really terrible thing. Injustice is everywhere. So let me try to introduce you to some concepts within forgiving. This is a picture of Ev Worthington, who's the person who hooked me into studying forgiveness back in the 1990s. He's a professor emeritus at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he spent the 80s and 90s developing a research program in forgiveness. The research indicates from 2004 to 2018, there were nearly 1,300 scientific records with the term forgiveness from the Scopus database, with over 100 articles published annually more recently. So it's continuing to have an extensive area of research. In that time, people could not agree on what forgiveness was, right? But pretty much people agree on what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not pardoning. It is not condoning, excusing, justifying, forgetting, or reconciling. The most accepted definition broadly is by McCullough, Pargament, and Thorson, who defined it as a pro-social change in thoughts, emotions, motivations, or behaviors. Right? Broad definition. With that large amount of research, I'm going to try to boil it all down for you and give us a little bit of a quick run through on forgiveness today. There are 3 primary theoretical bases for forgiveness research today. Evolutionary theory is one of the ones with a large amount of support. Forgiveness helps both societies and communities adapt to the environment that we live in, where offenses are ubiquitous, and forgiveness helps us survive more effectively most of the time. Now, revenge is common in most social species, and retaliation with anger and harm is common in both humans and social animals. And so evolutionary theory helps us to understand that. The largest area of research is in the stress and coping literature. And the idea is whether we are the giver of an offense or the receiver of an offense, this creates tension and stress. right? You might think back to those of you who raise your hands at having been through a crime, how much stress you felt, right? How much stress. I threw up after the shooting, right? Like it affects us deeply, right? And we try to cope with those, and one way to do that is through forgiveness, to diminish the stress and find resolution to the injustice. Forgiveness isn't the only way. In fact, revenge done effectively without retaliation tends to reduce stress as well. So you have to take that into account. But the stress and coping literature indicates that both state forgiveness, right, in the moment, and trait forgiveness, kind of being a forgiving person, is associated with more constructive coping strategies broadly. Forgiveness is adaptive as an emotion-focused coping strategy. There is also an application in the stress and coping literature on self-forgiveness. So when we have been offensive to someone else, it addresses our harm. This is highly contextualized with self-forgiveness being pro-social, and that would be helpful, but sometimes people are self-forgiving without indication to the effects on others, right? And those that are harmed may need recompense. There's a new area of research that's kind of pulled out of the stress and coping called dyadic model. And while Worthington, Strayer, and many others examined emotion-focused coping strategies within a stress and coping model, Strelin and Kovic have looked at a dyadic level coping, right? So offenses that occur, particularly intrapersonally, create tension on both sides. And so how does each person create kind of a set of activities that involve apology, forgiveness, recompense, injustice gap reduction? Within the literature, there are generally 4 types of forgiveness that the forgiveness experts have divided themselves up into. Intrapersonal focuses on the victim's perspective. So this is someone who has received an offense, right? Has been on the receiving end of an offense as a part of intrapersonal forgiveness. There's also an area of research of divine forgiveness, which is kind of an interesting thing. And of course, forgiveness exists in all the major religions prior to psychology ever being thought of. And so there's kind of a history there. Self-forgiveness is another area. It's a smaller area of forgiveness, but it focuses on the offense of others. Particularly, there's been research on combat stress and moral injury in military settings. And then societal level offense is about collectives and societies working out how to respond as members of a society where offenses have occurred. Within interpersonal, there's many types of forgiveness. I'm going to focus for a little bit here on emotional and decisional forgiveness, if you'll kind of walk with me for a minute. South African religious and political leader Desmond Tutu, does anybody know him? People know him? Was he mentioned earlier yesterday or something? No? Okay. Okay. He passed away recently, but he defined forgiveness as the capacity to make a new start. Forgiveness is the grace by which we enable the other person to get up, and to get up with dignity, to begin anew. In the act of forgiveness, we are declaring our faith in the future of a relationship and in the capacity of the wrongdoer to change. So, if you don't know him, if you're one of the few, he was one of the creators of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where thousands of offenses during the apartheid season in South Africa were brought to public confession, and people were given the opportunity to choose to forgive. This is not without controversy, and I'm aware, but many decisions to forego revenge were made in that commission, and the country was able to avoid a potential bloodbath that most people around the world were expecting, with leaders like Tutu and Nelson Mandela who had reason to demand revenge, but chose not to. After President, hold on, you know, you love it, technology, and then it won't scroll. Okay, there. After President Mandela was released from prison, as apartheid started to fall, President Mandela invited his white jailer to attend his inauguration as an honored guest. And this was the first of many gestures he would make in a spectacular way, showing a breathtaking magnanimity and willingness to forgive. This man, who had been vilified and hunted down as a dangerous fugitive, incarcerated for nearly 3 decades, would be transformed into the embodiment of forgiveness. He would be a potent agent for reconciliation and would urge his compatriots to work for it, which would form part of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he would appoint that to deal with their country's past. It is a great feat to forgive, but stories of forgiveness are all around us. They're probably in your life and in the lives of the people that you love and care about. Watching their actions over time, they seem to come to peace on an emotional level with the offenses of the past and decide to forgive. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a particularly good place to be able to differentiate between decisions to forgive and emotions of forgiving. And the emotions tend to take longer. Earlier, when I asked you if you ever had a time when you really wanted to forgive, but you just couldn't, it was probably emotional forgiveness that you were struggling with, right there. The decision to not take revenge, to not go after the person, right, to not ruminate about the offense, it's a little bit easier. It can be hard, but a little bit easier. But emotional forgiveness, to replace those negative emotions with more positive emotions, right, more empathy, more compassion, is very difficult for humans to do. Very useful. And another story of emotional forgiveness, this one led to reconciliation in a really strange way. After a long shift at the fire department, Matt Swazzell fell asleep while driving and crashed into a vehicle. He took the life of a pregnant mother named June Fitzgerald and injured her 19-month-old daughter. According to a report done by the Today Show, Fitzgerald's husband, so the widower, asked for the man's diminished sentence and began meeting with Swazzell for coffee and conversations. And many years later, the two remained close. The stress of this offense must have been extreme for both of them, right? And forgiveness was the path they chose to cope with it. This emotional process of forgiveness, replacing rumination and revenge fantasies and longing for justice that had happened in this case, right? They actually were able to take him to court, and he did face justice for his the killing of June Fitzgerald and the unborn pregnancy in her. That is just harder. It's just hard. But you probably are asking by now, should we forgive? Right? Is this even a good idea? James McNulty has done a series of research that he has pointed out and looked at the dark side of forgiveness. Sometimes those who are abusive or have offended will use their power in a relationship or in a society, a small or large one, to demand forgiveness and to diminish their own fault and their own guilt. James particularly does research on domestic violence, and he has found that victims who forgive, right, so a domestic violence situation, the victims sometimes choose to forgive. They're sometimes able to effectively use that forgiveness to regulate their partner away from offending in the future, right? Remembering that most domestic violence is not the most severe version of it, right? So that's inclusive. But there is a process where violence is increased by forgiveness. So if forgiveness happens, yes, I forgive you, and then the person offends more in a violent way. This is more unusual, and it seems to be descriptive of the severe characterological type of sociopathic offenders or violence, right? So who is the offender matters. What is the situation matters. When we choose to encourage clients or in our own personal lives when to communicate forgiveness interpersonally. All right. This is Julie Exline. She is a researcher at Case Western University who began studying a really interesting phenomenon about a decade ago. She actually was studying anger at God at Case Western students, and she was finding people who don't believe in God are angry at God. And she I was just talking to her. I was like, I don't understand. Yeah, so it's really interesting work. So it is a sticky theological subject. Most religions say that a deity or God can't be wrong, right? It's perfect. And so this makes forgiveness between a deity in a vertical way really interesting. In addition, most people would say they can't physically perceive a deity. I mean, once in a while we have patients who physically perceive deities, but beyond that, most deities are not physically perceived. And so that makes it very powerful, right? That it's not able to be perceived. It's in our own minds what we perceive. So this makes offenses that happen between humans and deities quite interesting and unique. But people do get angry at God and at deities. They blame God or their deity for events. There are 3 research studies that have shown and demonstrated that people who are more likely to report anger towards God if they are high in neuroticism, low in agreeableness, conscientiousness and self-esteem, or low in humility. So it's kind of an interesting area of research. They're looking for these personality traits. Another angle on divine forgiveness is seeking forgiveness from a divine figure or deity. So the meaning or nature of having wronged against a moral order or a sense of the sacred can be deeply impactful for people who are highly religious, which is a little over 80% of the population of the globe. So the latest Pew research shows about 16% of the population of the world is religiously unaffiliated, but even those that are unaffiliated often see themselves as believing in a God or a spirituality that applies to their life. So that means most clients and students and us would see the world through some kind of spiritual religious lens. And forgiveness would help them improve their karma, as in the driver on my tour in Thailand, or forgiveness from Yahweh or Jesus or Allah. And that's a major goal for many people. They want to set things straight, that there's been an injustice, and it's happened maybe on a horizontal level, but potentially on a vertical level as well. And research supports that this is important for people, that feeling that they have wronged the universe or that they have worked against karma or against their God is uniquely stressful for people. Right? And seeking forgiveness from a divine person or their actions that will end suffering, as in the understanding in Buddhism. This can be rich content for addressing problems in people's lives, whether through lament, through protest, that's always fun work, exploring anger towards deity or God or the universe, sometimes that they don't want to be there. The research is expanding beyond monotheistic religions as well, as a recent study of Hindu participants found that anger towards a Hindu god also exists and is an important stressor. So this concept applies to people who have doubts that God exists, as with atheists and agnostic participants stating that if a God were to exist, they would be angry with it. So the correlates of anger towards God for perceiving wrong or a sense of shame and guilt towards a deity show significant health and stress resonance responses. So it's important for us to not ignore this as part of life. All right, self-forgiveness. So we've covered interpersonal forgiveness and we've covered divine forgiveness. What about self-forgiveness? So Lydia Woodyard and Michael Wenzel at Adelaide University in Australia are the primary researchers that are kind of leading the research on self-forgiveness. They define self-forgiveness as a process of releasing resentment towards oneself for perceived wrongdoing. And some of the early research on this was on moral injury, particularly in combat level kinds of offenses, right? So things happen all the time in combat settings, and people come home, and part of the struggle of PTSD recovery is their moral injury. And if you've sat with somebody in that, I know I sat with a sniper once and who didn't protect one of his members of his team that died, and the moral injury work on that was extensive. So how do we address this self-condemnation? How do we work with it? So one of the things that happens when people have this self-condemnation and they move into being an offender is they will bifurcate the world into belonging into a moral social identity of kind of good people and people that are not. Right? And they'll put themselves in the not category. I'm not part of society. And it will cause them to further and further become part of the outside of society, right? Socially excluded. If you work with homeless or those who are socially excluded, you might find moral injury is one of the reasons why they have a sense of social exclusion. So this is a pathway that Woodyard and Wenzel are studying. There's also that we as humans have a need for agency. And when we have been morally offensive and we don't see a way to recompense for that, we have a tendency to feel lost. We have a tendency to feel that we have no agency in the world, right? And we humans need agency. It's very central to being human. And so that's another need that gets thwarted. A third one is a sense for meaning in life, right? So that we need a sense that what we do in the world matters and we affect the world in a positive way. And so if you're in the reprobate group and you perceive yourself that way as a wrongdoer, then you cannot have meaning, right? You're in the self-condemned space. So they've created a model of self-condemnation recovery, or like actually there's not really a recovery research that's extensive yet. There's some studies on self-forgiveness, but primarily the research right now is trying to understand the process. Like, how is it that people end up stuck and not able to move through self-forgiveness? So first of all, there's a perceived transgression of values, right? So I never thought I would be a murderer. I never thought I would cause a car accident that would kill a pregnant mom, right? And so there's a perceived transgression of values, and then people have a sense of need from that, and then they get into a trio of psychological factors. One is rumination. So you're going to hear me say rumination over and over. If you want a dissertation that's going to show effects for sure, study rumination and offenses. Like, it's just going to show up like every single time. So rumination is the bad boy of mental health, and it will harm people, right? So people get stuck in self-condemnation and rumination. What could I have done? What should I have done? If only, right? They'll kind of get stuck in the rumination or self-condemning thoughts. I'm just a horrible person. I never should have been born. Things like that. And then the second one is emotional cognitions, particularly negative self-appraisal. And then the third of that trio are behaviors. They'll engage in avoidance. These sound like trauma behaviors, right? Defensiveness, right? They're very difficult to live with. Most of my research is in couples work, and so the sniper was coming in for couples work, and that was really hard work. All right. So that's where self-forgiveness is at right now. There is a little bit of research towards working through self-forgiveness, and we'll talk a little bit more about interventions in a minute. So, societal forgiveness. America has a long list of countries that used to be our enemies, right? People that we were once so offended with that we went to war with them. Britain, Mexico, Spain, Germany, Japan, the Philippines. Right now, the country of America is offended by China, Russia, North Korea. What would it take for China to become the future equivalent of Germany? How do we as a country change and move forward to particularly prevent war? Right? How can that even be done? Offenses at the societal level are particularly complex and unique because it goes beyond one-on-one, right? It's not the car accident, right, and the widower who over time decide to forgive and reconcile their choice. It can be at national levels, tribal levels, group level offenses. They are ubiquitous historically. The definition of intergroup forgiveness by Daryl Van Tongeren is an internal transformation of motivation towards a perceived perpetrating outgroup that is situated within a specific collective, political, or societal context. I'm going to read that again because Daryl's smarter than me. So, an internal transformation of motivation toward a perceived perpetrating outgroup that is situated within a specific collective, political, or social context. Right? So that's societal forgiveness. And the research on this has been developing. There's a meta-analysis in 2014 and then research since then that identified 9 factors that seem to predict intergroup forgiveness. So they're clustered in 3 areas. So one is affective factors, so the ability to empathize. So you might think about, I like to think about Sting because I really like Sting mostly. And Sting had this old song, I hope the Russians love their children too, right? And it's just a really smart song for the Cold War because it builds empathy, right? Oh, they're parents too. They have children too, right? And of course, we're back in tension with Russia again. Yeah. But the ability to have empathy for the outgroup, the ability to name and identify negative emotions, right, that do exist, so that can fix people towards or move them away from societal level forgiveness, and an identification of collective guilt, right? So people need within a group to be able to say, hey, we are guilty of this. This is something that we as a society did wrong. Whenever people are able to state collective guilt, that moves towards collective forgiveness or societal forgiveness. When it doesn't happen, when people say, we didn't do anything, I didn't do that, that was previous generations. You ever heard that? Nah. Makes it much harder for people to move towards forgiveness. Second level of factors are cognitive factors. So the ability to trust the other, right? That the other is a good actor. right? And not a bad actor out to destroy you. And so that's a predictor on both ends of the prediction. Perceived victimhood, right? So who's being victimized here? And the installation of amends, right? So at the end of war, you generally do have amends of some sort that happens. Financial, prisoners are sent back home, like all kinds of things that try to improve, right, and move towards positivity. And then there are constraining factors. In-group identification. We're Americans, right? I live in the South, so I hear that once in a while. And with the accent. I think people say that in other parts of the country, too, with a different accent. But in-group identification prevents people from being able to empathize with the other, the out-group, and being able to see them as human. Low contact. Right, so these are old. You've seen these in the research, diversity research. So if people don't have contact with the other, which is why it's important that we have, travel. Right, it's important that high schoolers and college students go overseas, right, and spend time in other countries to increase contact. And then being able to find superordinate identification, like a common enemy, is a great way to get two countries to come together. Although it's not a great way to prevent war. Finding other more peaceful superordinate identification can help. This leads us to something really unique that happened in 2021. I wondered if anybody here was on the APA Council of Reps at that time. Sometimes we have people in this room that were part of that. Right? You guys heard about it. Yeah, it's been the talk, right? Yeah. It's a good talk, right? So it's a good thing to be talking about. So in October 29th, 2021, if you haven't heard, there was an apology to people of color for APA's role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy in the United States. It's long. I only have a little bit of it here, but I thought this is the opening of it. And it says the APA failed in its role leading the discipline of psychology, was complicit in contributing to systemic inequities, and hurt many through racism, racial discrimination, and denigration of people of color, thereby falling short on its mission to benefit society and improve lives. APA is profoundly sorry, accepts responsibility for, and owns the actions and inactions of APA itself, the discipline of psychology, and individual psychologists who stood as leaders for the organization and field. And they went on to detail some of that. One thing that I'd like to do is for us as programs to ponder and consider, what do programs like ours as leaders in the field, how do we expose our students to this, right, to this history? And I know this group of people is particularly good at it, but to the history, to the statement, to engaging what does an apology mean in the profession? How can something like this spur individuals within our programs and programs as a small society to engage in action towards equality, towards valuing, towards respect and dignity for those previously marginalized? What ownership of this apology letter do we have as our programs in our own histories even, right? And thinking about what the history is of your own program. I don't have an answer to that, but it's interesting. As someone who studies forgiveness, I think it's very interesting. And I've enjoyed watching it happen and cheering it for the most part. All right, now I'm going to get to how to forgive. Yes, we have a question from the audience. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you saw the Association of Black Psychologists actually rejected the APA apology and put a very formal rejection of it. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
It is not without controversy. Yeah, and I'm glad for the conversation. My understanding is that a wide variety of people helped create the apology letter. And as someone who is interested in apology and forgiveness, just transparently, that's my bent. I think what matters with this is what happens next, right? What matters is how does this go forward, not as the end, but as just a beginning, right? And ABSI, I think, will hold the profession's feet to the fire. At least I hope ABSI will, and that we all will be a part of that as the decades roll forward. So the past, one of the things with apologies and forgiveness is that you have to face the reality that the past has happened and mourn that it cannot change. The past cannot change. Only the future can change. And so I appreciated that piece of the apology letter. So yes, I know it's not without controversy and conversation and important conversations. So all the voices are important. All right. But if you wanted to forgive on an interpersonal level, on a self-forgiveness level, on a family level, that sort of thing, how would you do that? What would that look like? All right. This is what the research shows. So there are factors that help in forgiving. And this is kind of a pulling together like 1,000 research studies into one slide. So forgive me for being blunt about it, but a good apology does help. Think about that in your own family or friendships, right? People in your life that have offended you. If they come to you and they say something like, I am so sorry. I know this caused deep damage to you. I know this was hard on you. I see the pain that it caused. I see the tears within you. I will clean your toilets for a year. I am going to buy you dinner every time we go out for the next year. I am forever in your debt, right? You probably will be in a better place to offer a forgiveness in the near future anyway than if someone says, tough to be you. No apology. And so in interpersonal relationships, a good apology does help. It is a predictor of forgiveness and the dyadic forgiveness, particularly going forward, because it helps to bridge the injustice gap. Smaller offenses tend to be able to do that injustice gap pretty easily with an apology. It might be enough for people, or a small kind of recompense for that. The perceived intent of the offender is also one of the things that is a predictor, right? So if you perceive me as coming in here to offend you, if I have offended you yet, maybe that can happen, and you perceive me as like, knows better, did it on purpose, right, then my offense is going to be very difficult. There's a bigger injustice gap. But if I'm just kind of stupid or ignorant, then my injustice gap gets smaller, right? So we have time. The intent of the offender matters as you think about the people that have offended you. I even think about the man who came in and shot Mr. Craddock, that came in and shot, and my best understanding is that he was very depressed and isolated as a person, and so that helps, right, to understand the intent, even though the injustice is still there. It doesn't go away. I can't undo the past, right? But to not ruminate, it's helpful. Time is helpful. So over time, people have an easier time finding forgiveness. Biology seems to matter. So people that have strong cortisol and stress reactivity that's happening, or have a lot of rumination, right? And cortisol and stress reactivity and rumination go together, right? And that's what's happening biologically. And so that makes it more difficult for people to engage in a forgiveness process. Personality, everybody in the personality research loves to do the research on personality and forgiveness. And across many, many studies, probably way more than we need in my personal opinion, then low neuroticism and high agreeableness are consistently predictors, at least at the moderate level of ability to forgive. Extroversion and conscientiousness and openness to experience have rather small effect sizes when trying to predict forgiving or being a forgiving trait forgiveness. People who value forgiveness tend to forgive more. So this is also a great dissertation, likely to end in something that you expect. So being other-oriented is one aspect of humility. And so other orientation aspect of humility seems to be the particular aspect that is predicting forgiving and apologizing and forgiving both. People, however, that are at risk of future exploitation, so you think about a domestic violence research that McNulty does, when there's been a history of violence, not kind of a one-time fighting event, but a history of violence, the risk of future exploitation is quite high. And so that decreases the chances of forgiveness. And of course, that makes sense, right? Forgiveness isn't always the best choice in domestic violence situations. But relationships that are high in commitment and have a good history, right? So you think about your closest friend. Think about the people you work with that you love and think are awesome. And then think about that you had good relationships with. If they do something offensive to you, right, and you have good commitment and you have a good history together, that reduces the time, essentially, and the difficulty of forgiving. And then just the ability to empathize. So empathy seems to be, across research, one of the pathways to forgiveness for most people. All right. Group level forgiveness interventions. So there are two researchers who have done most of the research on group level forgiveness interventions. And there are multiple meta-analyses on that now, all showing moderate effect sizes. Those two models are Bob Enright at the University of Wisconsin and the process model, and then Ev Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth University with the REACH model. They've both been studied in multiple countries with various types of offenses, various types of participants. They both have curriculum and materials. You can go and get training in them. The process model is developed more as a therapy setting type of model with more complex kind of offenses and a more complex process to work through. There's research on sexual abuse victims and working through the process model, not without controversy, obviously, but for those who are seeking forgiveness, it assists them in that. The REACH model was designed more as a brief psychoeducational model, more like 5 or 6 hours in a group setting to assist people with a variety of offenses when they want to seek forgiveness. There is a self-forgiveness curriculum that's been developed by multiple people, and it exists in both clinical and psychoeducational settings, but not a lot of research on that. It's still fairly early in that. So if you run a clinic, right, one of the things you could consider engaging in is providing forgiveness educational groups as an adjunctive to the therapy that is provided to clients who desire to deal with their stress of being either an offender or an offended person through forgiveness. And there are people doing this all over the world that like to do that. So let me introduce you to the two major ones. This is the one I'm most affiliated with, to be transparent, because I was trained at VCU. And this is the REACH model. So the REACH model is an acronym, and you'll see the website there if this is something you want to learn more about. The REACH model starts with recall the hurt in a different way. So this is usually not a problem. People recall the offense against them, but the goal is to recall it in a more complex and nuanced way, to consider situational factors, to consider the reasons why the person might have engaged in the offense, to remember that that person is a human too, and not a monster. The second step in REACH is to empathize with the person who hurt you by emotionally replacing negative emotions with more positive emotions: empathy, sympathy, compassion, or love. Again, depending on the person, what's appropriate about that, the kind of nature of the relationship. The third step is altruistic gift to the person who hurt you. So here's interesting. They did some research comparing those. You may have heard this before. Like if you hold resentment in your heart against someone, you're only hurting your own heart. And there's actually a little bit of research that you're literally hurting your heart, but that rumination and revenge fantasies and that sort of thing is really hard on our physical health. But the other person's like skip-de-doo-dah through their day, right? They don't know that you're offended and upset, and you're the one, plotting their death on the weekends, and so you're the one being offended. And while that is very true, they actually did research where they compared you take this step of altruistic gift for your own sake, right? To release it from yourself because you're getting psychological damage by continuing to pursue revenge and rumination. And replace it with something else. And then they had another group randomly assigned to do it for the good of the offender, because they're a human, because being compassionate, everyone offends sometimes, and everyone needs forgiveness sometimes. Good for the offender. And the research showed better outcomes when people were doing it for the sake of the offender than for themselves. Which is just ironic. There's just like an irony in the study of forgiveness. It's complex. So the altruistic gift for the person who hurt you being good for the offender. So the universality of humans. The fourth level is to commit to forgiveness, right? And so to make some kind of commitment. And this is a place where people can differentiate between decisional and emotional forgiveness and be able to tell the difference between them in the work that they're doing. And then finally, holding on to forgiveness, even when doubt occurs, is setting people up is a very important step, actually, to set people up to understand that they're not going to go forward without pain in the future, like as they remember, right? And I do couples work, right? So when you had a bad day and things aren't going well and something reminds you of the old offense in the relationship, and then all of a sudden you're back to like, oh, I can't believe, you're out in the garage throwing things, right? And so that doesn't mean that the forgiveness didn't happen. It just means that the offense and the pain has been reactivated. So it's helping people set up for that. Bob Enright's work has 4 stages, each with details that I don't have time to get into. This is their website, internationalforgiveness.com at University of Wisconsin. But it works through uncovering the anger and spending time understanding the complexity of the anger and confronting the anger, admitting to their own shame, addressing just world theory, things like that. Decisions to forgive, right? That the old way isn't working and the person saying they want to forgive. And by the way, these interventions don't require anybody, of course. They can't. How would you require someone to forgive? Like, I'm not sure how that would even work. So if people want to, they have a decision to make there, and they work through that. Then there's a working phase, and the working phase involves some reframing, understanding empathy to the offender, so that pops up again, compassion as it arises, acceptance of the pain that has occurred as part of the past. And that's a stuck point for a lot of people. They get stuck on the pain that's happened. And finally, the deepening phase is finding meaning in the suffering of all people, realizing that everyone needs forgiveness and the universality involved in that. All right. So I will end with a confession that I struggle with this area. I struggle with it in the offenses that have happened with Mr. Craddock. I've struggled with forgiveness there, and I have struggled with other offenses that have happened with me and the people I love. And I particularly struggle with the inherent unfairness of it. It is an upside-down thing. This is a quote from a client of mine in the past, or close to the quote of what this person said. She did the offense. She was unfaithful. So I felt the pain of it. But I have to do all the work to forgive it too. So now I suffer. But it is this struggle to forgive, to remember my love for her, to remember we are both human, that she is suffering too and needs my forgiveness. It's the most important thing I've ever done. And it's really ironic that the most unfair thing and the biggest suffering of my life has turned out to be my best moment. It's an upside-down kind of liberation. It's not obvious. But it is a path that people have chosen for millennia. And I'll close with quotes from 2 people across millennia. Gandhi said, "It's easy enough to be friendly to one's friends, but to befriend the one who regards himself as your enemy is the quintessence of true religion. The other is mere business." And Cicero, of all people, who said, "Let us not listen to those who think we ought to be angry with our enemies and who believe this to be great and manly. Nothing is so praiseworthy, nothing so clearly shows a great and noble soul as clemency and readiness to forgive." So thank you very much.